Wyoming Territory, 1874. The mist had teeth. It chewed on the iron of the rails, leaving a cold silver sheen that reflected nothing but a bruised gray sky. Silver Junction Station was not a town. Not really. It was a raw nerve, a place where the eastbound engine stopped for water and wood, and where men spilled out onto the platform like dice from a cup. All angles and desperation. The air was thick. You could taste the coal smoke, sharp and acidic, cut with the smell of wet wool, stale whiskey, and the animal tang of the cattle pens 24 yards downwind. Steam hissed from the locomotive's belly, a rhythmic, angry sigh that punctuated the shouts of the baggage handlers and the low, rumbling talk of the prospectors, drovers, and railroad men who huddled in tight, grim-faced knots. She sat on a bench against the raw plank wall of the station house, trying to make herself small enough for the world to overlook. It was not working. She was ragged. Her dress, a calico faded to the color of dishwater, was torn at the cuff, and the mud on her hem was frozen stiff. In her arms, held so tightly her own knuckles were white stones, was a bundle, a baby girl, wrapped in a blanket almost as thin as her mother's dress. The woman on the bench had no papers. She wore no ring. She had no name. She had been sitting there since the sun failed to rise, and the platform's brief tolerance had worn thin. The station master, a man whose face looked carved from sour wood, stomped out of his office. He stopped in front of her, planting his boots wide. "That's long enough. The eastbound is taking on water, and then it's leaving. You ain't on the manifest. You move along." She looked up. Her eyes were wide, hollowed out by a fear so deep it had burned past tears. She could not speak. She only shook her head, a tiny, desperate motion. "Move along where—" A voice cracked from the crowd. A woman with a painted face and a hat sagging under the weight of a single wet feather laughed. She'd travel lighter without the baggage. Another man, a miner with a beard caked in red mud, spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed inches from her feet. "Leave the brat at the church door, girl. You might still be quick enough to catch the train." The woman flinched, curling her body around the infant, shielding it from the words. The baby, sensing the new wave of cold tension, began to stir, its face scrunching for a cry. The station master grunted, impatient. "That ain't my concern. My concern is the property of the Union Pacific Railroad. This platform is property. You ain't— Now, I won't." He was interrupted by a new presence. The man who stepped forward was not loud, but the crowd parted for him anyway. He wore a fine wool coat, buttoned tight, and a black string tie against a stark white shirt. He looked clean, which was its own kind of menace in Silver Junction. He was Thorne Kessler, a foreman for the railroad, a man who saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities. He didn't look at the woman as a person. He scanned her the way he would a piece of freight left unclaimed on the dock. He tapped a leather-bound ledger he carried under his arm. "Papers," he said. His voice was smooth, oiled. "Passage voucher, and the name of your sponsor." She just stared at him, her throat working. The silence stretched. Kessler's thin lips tightened. "No papers, no sponsor. You're a vagrant, girl. This is railroad land. We have rules." He motioned to the station master. "Have her removed from the platform. If she resists, fetch the marshal." The woman's breath hitched. She was trapped. The ring of leering, indifferent faces closed in. The station master reached for her arm, and then the door of the passenger car behind them thudded open. The boot that hit the iron step was worn, the leather scarred, the heel ground down. A man descended. He was tall, built of long, solid lines, and wrapped in a duster coat the color of the high plains dust. He paused on the bottom step, his gaze sweeping the platform once. His face was weathered by sun and wind, and his eyes were quiet, too quiet, the color of a winter sky just before the snow. He was just another cowboy, another hand moving through, but the air around him was still. He settled a worn hat on his head and stepped onto the platform, intending to walk straight past the small, cruel drama and into the station house. He was almost by them when the baby finally broke. It was not a loud cry. It was a thin, desperate wail that cut through the hiss of the steam and the rumble of the crowd. It was the sound of something small and hopeless in a world too large and too hard. The station master flinched, annoyed. Kessler's expression soured, as if bothered by a bad smell. The tall cowboy stopped. He did not turn his whole body, just his head. His quiet eyes moved from the station master's meaty hand to Kessler's impatient ledger, to the woman. He watched her frantically, uselessly, trying to rock and shush the infant, her own panic making the cry louder. He took one step, then another. He moved without hurry, but the station master took his hand off the woman's arm. Reeves Calder stood in front of her. He looked at the crying child, his expression unreadable. The platform had gone silent. The miners, the drovers, the painted woman, all of them watched. This was a new act in the play. Reeves pulled off his right-hand glove. His hand was large, the knuckles scarred, the palm calloused. He did not reach for the baby. He did not speak to the mother. He simply extended his index finger. The baby, blind in its misery, turned its head toward the new presence. The wailing hitched. The tiny, red raw fingers uncurled from the blanket and, by some raw instinct, found and clamped onto the man's finger. The cry stopped. It simply cut off, replaced by a wet hiccup. The baby's eyes, still squeezed shut, relaxed. The silence on the platform was now absolute. It was so quiet they could hear the tink of the engineer's hammer on the engine's drive rod, 50 yards away. Thorne Kessler was the first to recover. He was a man who hated things he could not file in his ledger. He snapped his book open, his voice sharp with irritation. "This is railroad business. Cowboy, the woman is a vagrant. She has no name. She has no right to be on this platform." Reeves Calder did not look at him. He was watching the tiny hand wrapped around his finger. He looked at the girl, at her chapped lips and the terror in her eyes. There was something else there, too, a flicker of a soul not yet entirely extinguished. He gave a slow, fractional nod, more to himself than to her. Then he turned his head, just enough to fix Kessler with those winter sky eyes. His first words were spoken low, not much more than a rumble. They sounded like bedrock. "She has one now." Kessler scoffed, a small, ugly sound. "And who might you be to—" "Right, Marin Hale," Reeves said. He spoke to the open ledger, not to the man holding it. The girl gasped, a tiny, sharp intake of breath. Marin Hale. The name hung in the cold air, foreign and impossible. She stared at the tall cowboy, this stranger who had given her a name as if pulling it from the air. She grabbed onto it. It was the first solid thing she had touched in days. It was a lifeline. "You can't just invent a person," Kessler snapped, his face flushing dark red. "The regulations are clear. Who are you? Where is her ticket?" Reeves finally pulled his gaze from the baby, who was now drifting back to sleep, and looked at Kessler. He reached inside his duster. For a moment, a few men tensed, but he pulled out a worn leather pouch. He untied the drawstring and tipped 2 heavy silver dollars onto the open page of Kessler's ledger. The clack of the coins on the paper was louder than a gunshot. "That's for a backing ticket," Reeves said. "Temporary guardian." He reached past Kessler and took the pencil tucked behind the station master's ear. He pulled the ledger toward him and signed his name at the bottom of the page, beneath the space for the sponsor. His script was plain, strong, and clear. Reeves Calder. He pushed the book back at Kessler. His eyes, for just a second, were not quiet at all. They were hard as iron. Kessler stared at the signature, then at the coins, then at Reeves. He was a man of rules, and this man had just followed them. but in a way that ripped all the power out of his hands. He snapped the ledger shut. "This is highly irregular. Calder, the Union Pacific does not—" The train whistle screamed, a long, deafening blast of steam that washed over the platform, shaking the very planks beneath their feet. The spell was broken. The engineer was signaling his departure in 2 minutes. The crowd stirred. Conversations restarting. Men moving toward the cars. Kessler gave Reeves a look of pure venom. He then looked at the woman, his eyes lingering, memorizing her face. He turned on his heel and marched back toward the private car at the end of the train. The station master just shook his head, baffled, and retreated to his office. The show was over. Reeves Calder put his glove back on. He looked at the woman, who was still staring at him, clutching her baby and her new name. "Ma'am." He nodded, his voice low again. From that moment, the woman known as No Name was gone. She had died on that bench. The person who slowly, shakily, got to her feet, her legs threatening to buckle but holding, was Marin Hale. The whistle shrieked again. The journey had been reset, the train's final. Shuddering gasp of steam was a punctuation mark. The locomotive began its slow, powerful churn, the massive drive wheels biting the iron. Marin Hale stood frozen, the sound a physical blow. Convinced this was the moment he would point her toward the cheapest passenger car, a stranger's charity ending as abruptly as it began. Reeves Calder did not move toward the train. He watched the cars begin to slide past, gaining speed, until the red glare of the caboose lantern was swallowed by the Wyoming mist. The platform felt suddenly vast and empty. He turned to her. He did not offer a hand. He simply inclined his head toward the rutted track that led away from the station, away from the town, away from the rails. "It's a ways," he said. He led her to a horse tied to a hitching post, a solid buckskin that looked as durable and quiet as its owner. He untied the reins, mounted in one fluid motion, and then looked down at her. For the first time, she saw the problem. The baby. One horse, and a man built like a wall of timber. He seemed to come to a decision. He swung his right leg back over the saddle and dropped to the ground. "You ride," he said. She stared at him, uncomprehending. I don't know how, not with—" "You'll learn." He cupped his hands. "Left foot." She did as she was told, her body moving with the jerky obedience of a sleepwalker. She put her muddy shoe into his grasp, and with a strength that felt as effortless as breathing, he lifted her straight up and into the saddle. She scrambled to find her balance, her free hand grabbing the horn, the other clutching the baby so tightly the infant let out a small squeak of protest. Reeves took the reins, looped them over the horse's neck, and then took the bridle in his left hand. He started walking. He was going to walk, leading the horse, for the entire journey. They left Silver Junction behind. The sounds of the rail yard faded, replaced by the crunch of his boots on the gravelly soil and the squeak of the saddle leather. The journey stretched from minutes to an hour, then 2. Marin had thought the station was the edge of the world, but the land that opened up before them was a different kind of emptiness. It was vast, gray-brown under the cold sky, rolling in long, slow waves of sage and dry grass. It was a land that did not care if you lived or died. She watched the back of the man walking in front of her. His duster swayed with each long stride. He never looked back. He just walked, a fixed point in the tilting landscape, pulling her and the child forward into an unknown future. Dry Creek Bend was not a ranch. It was a foothold. It was a place a man had dared the land to reclaim, and the land had not yet won. There was a low-slung stable, built of rough-sawn cottonwood, a corral, and a small, sturdy cabin. The most dominant feature was the windmill, its metal blades spinning with a steady, rhythmic creak squeak against the silence, pumping water from a deep well into a horse trough. Beside the cabin, a covered, 3-sided structure served as an outdoor kitchen, a heavy black stovepipe jutting from its roof. As they approached, a man emerged from the stable. He was older, bent in the back and leggy, with a face like a dried apple. He stopped, wiping his hands on a rag, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the woman on Reeves's horse. This was Ephraim Lyle. Reeves stopped the horse. "Ephraim, she'll be staying in the cabin? I'll take the bunkhouse." Ephraim's gaze was sharp and unwelcoming. He looked at Marin, then at the bundle in her arms. "That a baby?" he asked, stating the obvious. "It is," Reeves said. "We ain't set up for that," Ephraim grunted, gesturing vaguely at Marin. "We are now," Reeves replied, his tone flat, leaving no room for argument. He helped Marin down, his hands at her waist, setting her on the ground as if she were made of glass. She staggered, her legs numb from the ride. She did not look at Ephraim. She did not look at Reeves. She looked at the ground, at the cabin door, at anything but a human face. Her left hand had come up to grip her right arm, and Ephraim's sharp eyes caught the mark just above her wrist bone, a pale, puckered circle, the old scar of a rope or a tight cinched strap. She whispered. The two men leaned in slightly to hear her. Please don't take the baby from me. I'll work. I'll do anything. Just please don't take her." Reeves looked at Ephraim. The old man's gaze softened. "Just a fraction." The defiance was gone, replaced by a deep, weary suspicion of the world that had put that scar on her wrist. "Nobody's taking the child, ma'am," Ephraim said gruffly, turning back to the stable. "Fire's cold. Stove needs wood." Reeves took the baby from her arms. Marin flinched, a small, terrified sound catching in her throat. But his hands were sure. He held the infant with an awkward but secure grip. "Go inside. Get warm." The cabin was one room, but it was clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a rope-strung bed frame in the corner. Reeves entered behind her and crossed to the fireplace. Tucked against the wall was a small, crudely built box of pine, sanded smooth, with two curved rockers on the bottom. A cradle. He must have built it, sometime in his past, for a reason she could not guess. He gently placed the sleeping baby inside. The infant stirred, her tiny mouth rooting, her fingers curling. A small brown bird, a wren, landed on the windowsill outside, chirped twice, and darted away. "Wren," Marin whispered, the first word she had spoken that was not born of fear. "Her name. It could be Wren." Reeves looked from the baby to the empty window. "Wren." He agreed. He nodded. "Once. Fits." Before dusk, a wagon clattered into the yard. A woman swung down, carrying a basket. She was solid, with red apple cheeks and capable, flour-dusted hands. This was Una Merritt, who ran the small diner in Silver Junction, the only place a man could get coffee that didn't taste like boiled boots. She was the territory's unofficial heart, a widow who had survived by feeding the harshness. She marched into the cabin, took one look at Marin's ragged state, at the baby in the box, and clicked her tongue. "Ephraim said you'd brought home a stray," she said to Reeves, who had followed her in. "He failed to mention it was two." She unpacked her basket without ceremony. Clean linen rags for diapers, a jar of thick goat's milk, a loaf of dark bread. "You're too thin to feed her proper right now," she said to Marin, her voice blunt but not unkind. "This will do till you've got food in you." Marin just stared, overwhelmed by the practicality of the kindness. Una showed her how to soak a corner of clean linen in the milk and let Wren suckle. The baby ate, her eyes finally opening, dark and clear. Marin began to work the next day. She was a shadow, but a determined one. She rose before the sun, her body aching, but she moved. She learned to muck the stalls, the sharp smell of ammonia and hay a strange comfort. She hauled buckets of water from the windmill's trough, her thin arms shaking, But she did not drop them. She learned to scrub the iron skillets from the evening meal, her hands raw in the lye soap. Ephraim watched her. He saw her try to saddle the buckskin, her movements clumsy, and stepped in, his gnarled hands guiding hers on the cinch. Pull left, then up. Not just tight, but smart. He stopped finding fault and started leaving her tasks. He began to nod when she passed, a curt gesture that was, from him, a shout of approval. The evening settled into a rhythm. The land grew dark, the only light coming from the cabin and the red glow of the outdoor stove. Reeves would cook. He made one thing, and he made it well beans, thick with salt pork and molasses, simmered for hours in a heavy Dutch oven. Keeps the last man standing, Ephraim had muttered one night. Reeves would dish 2 bowls. He would hand one to Marin, then take his own and sit on the porch steps, his back to the cabin. It was a habit, she realized, of a man who had returned from something awful, alone, for a very long time. Marin would sit on the cabin's threshold, close enough to hear Wren breathing from the cradle. She ate slowly, every bite a conscious act of rebuilding. She watched Wren sleep. Reeves kept his distance, a silent guardian on the porch. He said little. He did much. He fixed a loose board on the porch. He rehung the cabin door so it didn't squeak. He stacked firewood by her hand. The silence between them was not empty. It was a wide, open space, and in it, something was growing. It was the feeling a person gets when they have been running for 100 miles and finally are allowed to stop. It was the quiet, solid safety of the ground. 1 week after her arrival, a horse was ridden hard into the yard. It was not Ephraim's steady pace or Una's wagon. This was panic. A young man, a clerk from the railroad office, slid from the saddle, his chest heaving. "Mr. Calder," he panted, running to the porch where Reeves had just stood up. Reeves held up a hand, silencing him, his eyes flicking to the cabin door where Marin had appeared, her face pale. The clerk lowered his voice, but the wind carried his words. "It's Kessler. He's been at the station half the day. He's asking questions. He's furious. He's asking everyone. The marshal, the hands. He's asking about a nameless widow who left the platform. And he's asking—" The clerk swallowed. "About a lost package. He says something was stolen." The air went still. The only sound was the creak-squeak of the windmill, suddenly loud and ominous. Reeves's hand moved, not toward his gun, but to the leather strap of his holster, his fingers tightening on it, reseating the weight on his hip. It was the smallest of movements, but it was an answer. Marin backed into the cabin's shadow, her hand flying to her own chest, over her heart. She pulled Wren from the cradle, holding the baby so tightly the infant fussed. Instinct, sharp and cold, was screaming. The storm had found them. Later that night, long after the clerk had watered his horse and fled back to town, Marin saw a light in the main cabin, which Reeves had given over to her. He was at the small table, his back to the door. He had unrolled a long sheet of paper. She stepped closer. It was a map, a survey map of the railroad's new branch line. It showed the steel track pushing west, swallowing the prairie, running straight toward the next town, Kettle Ridge. But just before the town, the line on the map stopped. It choked. It was held back by a single, small square of land, a parcel that jutted into the railroad's path. There was no name on the square, no explanation for why it had not, like all the others, already been condemned and seized. It just sat there, defiant, blocking the way. The clerk's horse was a disappearing puff of dust on the horizon, but the panic it left behind settled in the cabin like cold smoke. The news hung in the air, Kessler. Lost package, nameless widow. Reeves stood by the table, his hand still resting on the map, his gaze fixed on that small, defiant square of land. Ephraim had come in from the stable, drawn by the urgent hoofbeats, and now leaned against the doorframe, his face grim. "He'll be back," Ephraim stated. It was not a guess. Men like Kessler, they don't lose things. They just misplace them, and they tear up the ground to find them. Reeves finally looked at Marin. She was standing by the cold hearth, her arms wrapped around herself. The baby still held tight. The safety of the past week evaporated, leaving the raw, cold fear from the train platform. "What package?" Reeves asked, his voice quiet. "What did you have when you got off that train?" Marin's throat closed. She shook her head, her mind a frantic, empty box. "Nothing. I had what you saw. This dress, the baby, the blanket." "The blanket," Una Merritt said, stepping into the cabin. She had arrived moments after the clerk, her wagon loaded with supplies, her face creased with worry. "You were clutching that baby child, but you were clutching the blanket just as hard." Una moved toward her, her presence warm and solid. "Let me see it." Marin hesitated. Then, slowly, she walked to the cradle and lifted the thin, worn blanket. Wren was sleeping on a piece of sheepskin Reeves had provided. Marin handed the blanket to Una. It was a poor thing. Thin wool, washed so many times it was almost felt, the color of weak tea. Una, a woman whose life was built on mending and making do, ran her practical fingers over it. She felt the edges, the corners, and then she paused, her brow furrowing. "This hem," she murmured, mostly to herself. "The thread is wrong. It's rough, like twine, and the stitching, it's thick, clumsy." She held it up to the light of the single lantern. Ephraim and Reeves watched. Una pulled a small pair of sewing scissors from her apron pocket, bit the thread, and began to pick at the clumsy stitches. "There's something in here," she said, her voice sharp with discovery. She pulled at the wool, and the seam parted, revealing a dark fold inside. Reeves stepped forward. "Let me." He set the lantern on the table. He took the blanket from her and drew the skinning knife from the sheath on his belt. The blade was razor sharp, a working tool, with a surgeon's steadiness. He didn't cut the wool, but slit the heavy threads holding the hem closed. He worked for a full minute in complete silence. With the seam open, he pinched the edge of the hidden object and slowly, carefully, pulled. It was not a package. It was a single sheet of vellum, folded into a small, tight square. It was thin, almost translucent, and covered in tight, precise script. It was a carbon copy. Reeves unfolded it on the table under the lantern. The four of them leaned in. The heading was Stark Union Pacific Railroad, Kettle Ridge Division Land Compensation Manifest. Below were columns of figures, dates, and shipping codes. But it was the final column that held the poison. It listed compensation parcels, heavy crates, furniture, machinery meant for settlers whose land had been claimed. Kessler's signature, a sharp, arrogant slash of ink, was at the bottom of the page, authorizing the shipments. "I don't understand," Marin whispered. "You're not meant to," Reeves said, his finger tracing a line. "This is the proof. Look, the parcels are listed for Kettle Ridge, but the routing codes, Ephraim. These codes ain't for the ridge. They're for the depot at Cheyenne. Hold for collection." Ephraim squinted. "Cheyenne? That's Kessler's main office. He's stealing it. He's claiming the company paid the settlers, and then he's shipping the payment back to himself. Land fraud." Reeves looked at Marin, his eyes dark. "This is Kessler's lost package. This is the proof. He must have known it was on that train. He doesn't know who has it, just that a nameless widow was the only one unaccounted for. He thinks you stole it." Marin's breath hitched. The memory, the one she had been pushing away, broke through. I remember," she said, her voice a dry rasp. The three of them turned to her. "I don't know how I got on the train. I woke up. It was dark, cold. I was in a boxcar. hidden behind some crates. The smell, it was sharp, like pine tar. She was seeing it now. I was terrified. The train was stopping. I heard men shouting outside. The door slid open, just a crack. A woman was there. I couldn't see her face. Just her skirt. She pushed the baby into my arms. This baby, Wren, she was so frantic. Marin was shaking, her own hands gripping the air as if holding the child for the first time. She whispered. She said, "He's dead. They killed him. They'll kill us." She pushed the blanket, this blanket, at me. She said, "Keep the baby and keep the blanket. Don't lose the blanket. God help you. Run." The silence in the cabin was heavier than stone. Wren was not her child. She had been given this baby, this evidence. She was a mule, a decoy, and she had not even known it. It was Ephraim who spoke, his voice gravelly, connecting the last terrible piece. He had been staring at the map, at the small, stubborn square of land. "I know this story," he said quietly. "It's been whispers, just whispers in the feed store, at the saloon, about a young clerk. Jonah Bell worked in the land office for the railroad. Smart, too smart, started asking questions." He looked at Reeves. "Folks said he'd inherited land from his grandpa, a worthless piece of rock, everyone thought, till the railroad decided to go through it. That piece of land, right there." He pointed at the map. "The one blocking the line." He looked at Marin, his eyes full of a sudden, terrible pity. Jonah Bell was sweet on a seamstress, talked to marrying her. Then, about 2 months back, Jonah had an accident, caught between 2 coupling cars, crushed him. Kessler himself signed the report. A tragedy. He let the word hang in the air. "And the seamstress," Ephraim finished, his voice dropping. "She vanished, about the same time." Una gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, Lord, the baby!" Reeves said it, his voice flat. "Is Wren Bell, heir to the land Kessler needs. This ledger is the proof he was stealing. Jonah Bell found it, and Kessler killed him for it." Marin sank onto the bench, her legs giving way. She was not a thief. She was a witness, a target, and she was holding the one thing, the one person, that could burn Thorne Kessler to the ground. Reeves folded the vellum. He slid it back into its hiding place in the blanket hem. For a long moment, he just looked at Marin, his face impossible to read. Then he spoke, laying out the world as it now was. "You have 2 choices," he said. "Kessler thinks you're the seamstress, or he thinks you're just a drifter who got lucky. It doesn't matter. He will find you. And when he does, he will take that blanket, and he will silence you. Him, or the men he hires." He held her gaze. "I can take you south tonight. We can ride to the Colorado line, put you on a different train. You can be Marin Hale somewhere else. You and Wren can disappear. No one would blame you." He paused. "Or you can stay. You can stand on the name I gave you, and you can fight." Marin looked down at her hands. They were raw from hauling water, the nails broken. They were no longer the hands of a ghost. They were the hands of someone who worked. She looked at the cradle. Wren, a baby who had a name, a murdered father, a stolen inheritance, a baby who had been thrust into her arms in the dark, a desperate act of trust. Her own namelessness, her own past, felt tied to this child's future. To run would be to abandon the child, and to abandon the name she had just been given. She lifted her chin. Her voice was not loud, but it did not tremble. "I stay," she said. A flicker of something respect, approval passed through Reeves's quiet eyes. He nodded. Once, the choice was made. The air in the cabin changed. Fear was still there, but it was being shouldered aside by something harder. Strategy. "Good," Reeves said. "Una, Ephraim, we need a plan." Reeves took command. "First, we hide this." He held up the blanket. "Ephraim, The old root cellar, behind the false stone. Ephraim nodded. Second, we make a decoy. Una, can you stitch another blanket? Make it look like this one, Ephraim. We'll need another forged ledger, something to leak, to make Kessler chase a shadow. And third, Reeves said, turning to Una, we need allies. We need proof about Jonah Bell. Lydia Voss, Una said instantly. At Kettle Ridge, her husband was the old station master, before Kessler had him put out to pasture. He died bitter. Lydia, she hates the railroad, and she knows everything. They say she kept all his private logbooks in a locked cabinet. Go to her, Reeves said. Tomorrow. Go as a friend. See what she knows about Jonah Bell. See if she'll stand with us. Una's jaw was set. She will. Ephraim and Una left, taking the real blanket with them, moving with quiet purpose. Reeves took the map and put it away. The cabin was suddenly quiet again, just Marin and the sleeping child. She felt the exhaustion of the day, but her mind was clearer than it had been since she woke up in that boxcar. She saw a small, leather-bound book on the shelf. One Reeves used to track feed and supplies. She took it, and the pencil that lay beside it. She sat at the table, the lantern casting a small golden circle. She opened the book to a clean page. She had to remember. She had to anchor the fragments before they floated away. She began to write. Smell pine tar, lamp oil, cold metal, sound. A train whistle, too close. Boots on a wood platform, heavy. A man shouting. Words. Voss. She paused, her pencil hovering. Why that name had the woman whispered it, V? No, Voss. She wrote another line. Branch line 3. It meant nothing. It was just a piece of sound, but she wrote it down. She looked at the words, a map of a past she could not see. Then she looked at the cradle. She had a name. The baby had a story, and now they had a fight. The arrival was not quiet. 3 riders, silhouetted against the harsh afternoon sun, topped the rise overlooking Dry Creek Bend. They did not ride like cattlemen, who moved with the land, but like men who saw the land as something to be crossed and conquered. Thorne Kessler sat on a fine black gelding, his posture rigid, his long coat perfectly buttoned. He was flanked by 2 men, hired bulk. They were Pinkertons, or at least claimed the name, men who sold their capacity for intimidation. The one on the right was Bram, thick-necked and carrying a shotgun across his pommel. The one on the left was Sutter, younger, with nervous, darting eyes and a new rifle gleaming in his saddle scabbard. They pulled up, their horses blowing, and surveyed the ranch. What they saw was not what they expected. The main corral was empty. The sound of cattle, the usual lowing and shuffling, was gone. Instead, from a mile to the north, they could hear the faint shouts of men driving a herd. Reeves had been in motion since Una's wagon had disappeared over the horizon that morning. He'll come here first, he'd told Ephraim, his voice flat. Let's not be here for him. They had spent the morning pushing the ranch's small herd of 24 head into the broken country of the north pasture, a place of deep gullies and thick brush. It was a change in the rhythm of the place, a deliberate disruption. It made the ranch look unsettled, as if in the process of being abandoned. While Ephraim and Reeves drew the obvious line of sight, Reeves had given Marin her instructions. He had brought her to a small, abandoned line shack, 2 miles south of the main cabin, tucked into a dry wash and invisible from the main track. It was a one-room hovel, smelling of dust and old salt. Kessler thinks you're a frightened rabbit, he'd said, his voice low. Rabbits hide. He had handed her the real blanket, the one with the vellum sewn inside, which he had retrieved from the root cellar himself. Ephraim and Una did their part. This is ours. He pointed to a large wooden barrel in the corner. Cattle salt. It's caked hard as stone. Marin, holding Wren, had used Reeves's skinning knife to cut a block of the salt out, creating a cavity. She had wrapped the blanket in a piece of oiled canvas, pushed it deep inside, and hammered the salt block back in place. It was invisible, secure. Now, from the line shack's single dirty window, she watched the 3 riders dismount at the main cabin. Her heart was a cold, hard knot in her chest. Kessler and his men found an empty yard. The cabin was unlocked. The hearth was cold. "They've run," Sutter said, his voice high. "We spooked 'em." Kessler's lip curled. He ran a gloved finger over the top of the cold stove. "He left his beans." He pointed to the Dutch oven, still sitting near the stove. "A man like Calder doesn't run from a square meal. They're close." He turned to his men. "Bram, check the stable. Sutter, the bunkhouse. Find me anything. A track. A dropped piece of paper. I want to know which way they bled." The sun began to bleed out of the sky, pulling the light with it. The wind picked up, no longer a breeze but a high, thin whine, and with the wind came the sound of the windmill, the sound of Dry Creek Bend. Squeak, shurink, squeak, shurink. It was the sound of a knife being sharpened on a whetstone. Kessler stood on the porch, his fury a palpable thing, a cold aura that warred with the wind. He did not know that Reeves Calder had doubled back, while Kessler stared at the cold stove. Reeves was lying flat on the ridge above the cabin, watching. He had moved on foot, silent as a mountain cat, his duster the color of the twilight rock. He was not a fighter, not in the way these men were. He was a trapper, and these men were in his trap. Darkness fell like a dropped curtain. Kessler lit the lantern in the cabin, its yellow light a defiant beacon, making the shadows outside that much deeper. "Nothing in the stable," Bram reported, his voice a low growl. "Just hay." "The bunkhouse is—" Sutter started, then yelped. There was a crash, the sound of a man falling hard, a rifle clattering on the packed earth, and a sharp, profane curse. Kessler burst from the cabin. Bram rounded the corner, shotgun raised. Sutter was on his hands and knees, gasping, his new rifle lying 10 feet away. "I tripped," he spat, scrambling for the gun. There's a wire." Bram lowered his shotgun and stomped over. Between the corner of the bunkhouse and the main water trough, a single, thin strand of baling wire had been stretched, barely 6 inches off the ground. It was a simple thing, something a man would string to dry hides, or something a man would string to catch a clumsy foot in the dark. Kessler looked at the wire. He looked at the deep, moonless dark that surrounded their small island of lantern light. The squeak shrink of the windmill sounded like a mocking laugh. Reeves was already gone. He had not struck. He had not fired a shot. He had just pulled one wire. He had announced his presence. Not with a shout, but with their own failure. He had made them loud. He had made them clumsy. And now, they knew they were being watched. "Get inside," Kessler snarled. "Both of you. We wait for light." Reeves did not wait. He moved under the cover of the wind, circling wide around the ranch, his mind 2 steps ahead. He went to the mouth of the narrow canyon that cut south, the one that led away from the line shack, toward the empty high country. He dismounted his horse and began to walk. He did not walk with his usual ground-eating stride. He walked like a man in a hurry, a man in a panic. He scuffed his boots, breaking the delicate crust of the soil. He kicked stones loose. He snapped low-hanging branches and let them fall. He made a trail, wide and crude and obvious, a trail that screamed flight. He led them into the empty. At first light, Kessler was the one who found the tracks. He knelt, a small, cruel smile touching his lips. "Here," he said, pointing, "headed south and running hard. He thinks he can lose us in the canyons." He mounted. "Let's go, gentlemen. The rabbit has flushed." The 3 riders spurred their horses, kicking up dust, swallowing the bait whole. They rode south, into the maze of rock, away from the woman and the child. Marin had not slept. She sat on the small, broken step of the line shack, Wren sleeping against her chest, wrapped in a different, cleaner blanket. She watched the sun turn the eastern ridge from black to purple to a sharp, burning gold. The fear was real. It was a cold stone in her stomach. She had heard the shout in the night, the distant noise, and had spent hours staring into the dark, imagining Kessler's face at the window. But as the light hit her, she felt something else. The fear had a shape. It was the shape of Thorne Kessler. But her courage had a name. It was Marin. It was the name that man on the ridge had given her. It was the name she had chosen to keep. She was still sitting there, her body stiff with cold, when the sound of a wagon made her jump to her feet, her hand flying to the knife Reeves had left her. It was Una's wagon, jouncing down the dry wash, pulled by her single, sturdy mule. Una pulled up, her face a mask of exhaustion and triumph. "They're gone," Marin said, pointing to the tracks heading south. "Good," Una panted, climbing down. "Reeves said he'd lead them on a fool's hunt. I've got news. Hot news." She grabbed a canteen from the wagon and drank deep. "I found her, Lydia Voss." Reeves appeared as if from the earth itself. He walked out from the cover of the creek bed, his horse following, reins dragging. He had circled back, a ghost in the morning light. He took the canteen from Una and drank. "Well, she's scared," Una said. "Her husband. Kessler ruined him, took his pension, his name. She's been living on nothing, but she's not just scared. She's angry." Una looked from Reeves to Marin. "She'll talk. She has the books. She has Jonah Bell's original complaint, the one her husband refused to file. She has it all. But she won't meet in secret. She's not a fool. She said Kessler would burn her house down with her in it." "Where?" Reeves asked. "In public," Una said, a small smile playing on her lips. "The chapel, the little wooden one by Sweetwater Creek. Tomorrow," she said, "I'll be there for the noon prayer. God can be our witness." Reeves was silent for a long time. He stared south, toward the canyons where Kessler was currently chasing his own shadow. He turned to Marin. "Kessler will be back. He's smart. He'll know he was fooled, and he'll be twice as angry. But it'll take him the rest of today, maybe till tomorrow, to figure it out. That's our window." He looked at her, his gaze direct. "Tomorrow, you and I are going to that chapel. Una will stay here with Wren." Marin's breath caught. "Me? You?" he said. "You're the one who woke up in the boxcar. You're the one who carried the child. She needs to see who she's fighting for. But when we get there—" He held her gaze. "I'll do the talking. You just stand, be seen, and you keep silent, the way I used to." Marin looked at this man, who had spoken perhaps 100 words to her, each one weighing a pound. She saw the strategy. Silence was not weakness. It was a shield. It was a weapon. It was the thing you held back until you had the one true thing to say. She nodded, and a small, wry smile touched her own lips. "I'm learning how." The next dawn was a spectacle. The sky was clear, but as the sun rose, a massive flock of crows rose from the barley field near the creek. Swirling in a black, noisy vortex against the clean light, they wheeled and turned, a dark funnel cloud. Marin, standing at the door of the line shack, shivered. Is it a bad sign?" Reeves, tightening the cinch on his buckskin, did not look up. "It's crows. Marin, they're just crows. They do what they do." He finished with the saddle and turned. Una was holding Wren. Marin was ready, her hat pulled low. He mounted his horse, then reached a hand down for her, pulling her up to sit behind him, her arms circling his waist. As he settled in the saddle, Wren, who had been watching him with wide, solemn eyes, reached out, the baby's tiny, perfect hand, the one that had stopped a whale at the train station, uncurled. Her fingers brushed his gloved hand, then found his index finger and gripped it tight. Reeves froze. He looked down at the tiny hand. Marin, sitting behind him, watched his back. She could not see his face, but she saw his shoulders, which were always braced, always set, suddenly soften. She saw the tension in his neck release, just for a second. For the first time, she felt the storm in him, the cold, quiet rage he carried. Gentle, it did not go away, but it made room. He nodded, more to the child than to anyone else. Then, with his finger still held by the baby, he turned the horse's head toward Sweetwater Creek. The Sweetwater Creek Chapel was not a house of God. It was a 10 by 20 wooden box, baked dry by the sun, that smelled of dust, mice, and old, cracked hymn books. The wind rattled its one window, and the light that came through was thin and yellow. It was a place for last resorts. Reeves pushed the door open, the hinges screaming in protest. He went in first, his eyes sweeping the empty pews, the plain wooden cross on the far wall. Marin followed, her arms wrapped around herself, her boots echoing on the wide plank floor. They were alone. They sat in the front pew, in silence, and waited. The wind howled, a low, mournful sound. Marin counted her breaths. She was just beginning to think this was a trap, that Lydia Voss would not come, when the door screamed open again. The woman who stood there was small, but not fragile. She was built of the same hard, dry material as the land itself. She wore a simple black dress, the color of a permanent shadow. Her graying hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull the skin of her face taut. This was Lydia Voss. Her eyes, dark and sharp as obsidian chips, found them instantly. She did not apologize for being late. She did not offer a greeting. She closed the door, the sound final, and walked down the aisle, her steps measured. She did not sit with them. She stood in front of them, by the empty lectern, as if she were the one giving the sermon. She looked at Reeves. Una said you were a man who listens more than he talks. Good. I have no time for men who like the sound of their own voices. My husband was one. It got him a cheap casket. Her gaze shifted to Marin, sharp and appraising. And you are the one from the station, the ghost. Marin stiffened, but she remembered Reeves's instruction. She held the woman's gaze. She kept silent. Lydia nodded, a curt, satisfied gesture. So, you're the one who survived. I wondered, I prayed, in this drafty box, but I did not hope. Reeves spoke, his voice low, fitting the dusty quiet. You know why we're here. Jonah Bell. Lydia's face hardened. Jonah Bell. Yes, a good boy, a stupid boy. He thought the railroad was a future. I told him it was a snake. You don't make a pet of a snake. You don't work for it, and you don't try to steal its eggs. It will bite you. And it did. She began to pace. 3 steps left, 3 steps right, her hands clasped behind her back. She was finally speaking what she had held in for months, and the words were acid. My husband, Arlo, he was the station master for 20 years. He kept the books, all the books, the real ones, and the ones Kessler showed the inspectors from Omaha. She stopped, looking at Reeves. You know what land compensation is. Mr. Calder. It's the scraps the railroad throws to the settlers whose lives they've ruined. It's a new stove, a team of mules, 1,000 pounds of seed. It's supposed to be a new start, somewhere else. Kessler. She spat the name. He found a better way. He had Arlo change the books. The compensation wasn't compensation. It was operational fees, shipping tariffs, surveying charges. He billed the settlers for their own ruin. He took their payments, their mules, their seed, and filed it all as costs. He pushed them off their land with nothing but the dust in their pockets. And the railroad praised him for saving the company $10,000. Jonah Bell was a clerk, Marin whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Lydia's sharp eyes snapped to her. And he had a good head for numbers, and he was in love. That made him brave, and that made him foolish. He found the real ledger. He saw the theft, and he saw his own future. She pointed a thin finger, not at Marin, but toward the window, toward the west. Jonah's land, the piece that blocks the new branch line. He knew Kessler needed it, and he knew Kessler would cheat him. So he kept the proof. He was going to expose Kessler, trade the ledger for a fair price on his land, and take his girl, the seamstress, to California. But Kessler found out. Reeves said it was a statement. "Kessler finds out everything," Lydia said, her voice dropping. "He brought Jonah in, offered him a promotion, offered him money. Jonah refused. He was a good boy, as I said, stupid. 2 days later, his foot slipped while he was coupling cars. These engines, they don't leave much." The chapel was silent. Marin felt a cold dread, a sickness. She finally understood. "The seamstress and the baby." "Where next?" Lydia finished. "Kessler is tidy. He likes his paperwork clean. No heirs, no witnesses. The girl, Anna, she knew what Kessler was. When she heard about Jonah, she ran. She came to me, half mad with grief, the baby in her arms. She had the one thing Jonah had kept safe." "The vellum," Reeves said. "Jonah wasn't a complete fool," Lydia said. "He'd made a copy, and he'd stolen the company's lead seal press, the one they use for authenticating manifests. He gave them to Anna. He told her, 'If anything happens, go to Lydia Voss.' So she came to me with the baby and the proof, and I knew Kessler would be right behind her." Lydia finally looked at Marin with something other than appraisal. It was a cold, hard confession. "I had no time. I had to get that proof out, and I had to hide the child. Anna, she was too well known. Kessler's men were already watching the stages, so I looked for a ghost." She gestured at Marin. I'd seen you on the freight platform, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the late-night train, the one that carried vagrants and cattle. You were perfect. You were no one. You had no name, no past. Who would look for you?" Marin felt the blood drain from her face. She had been a tool, a gamble. "I found Anna's thin blanket," Lydia continued, her voice relentless. "I sewed the vellum and the seal inside. I took the baby from Anna and told her to hide in the church cellar. Then I went to the train. I found you in that empty boxcar. I shoved the child into your arms. I told you to run. I never expected to see you again. I hoped, the proof might make it to Cheyenne, that someone might find it on a dead girl and a baby, and it would start a question. The girl was you. You survived," Lydia said. "You brought the proof and the heir straight to a man who isn't afraid of Thorne Kessler. I did not hope, but my prayer was answered." Her morality was as gray and hard as the land. She had used Marin, gambled her life, on a desperate, long-shot chance. Reeves looked at Lydia, not with judgment, but with a new, cold understanding. He saw a woman who had fought with the only weapon she had, desperation. "So," Reeves said, pulling the conversation back to the present, "you'll testify." "I will not," Lydia said. Marin and Reeves stared at her. "What?" "I will not be found in a ditch like Jonah Bell, or have an accident in my own home," Lydia said sharply. "Kessler's power is in the dark. He does his work in secret, with whispers, with accidents. You cannot fight him in a dark chapel, or in a marshal's office. The marshal works for the railroad. The judge eats at Kessler's table. You fight him in the light, or you don't fight him at all." "What do you mean?" Marin asked. "I mean," Lydia said, "that I will stand in the bright noon sun, surrounded by 100 people. I will stand where every eye can see me, and every ear can hear me. I will stand where, if one of his Pinkerton thugs so much as touches me, it's not an accident. It's a public act. Secrecy is Kessler's power. We have to break that spell publicly." Reeves was very still. His eyes, usually quiet, now had a dangerous light in them. He was seeing the shape of it. The wind rattled the window, and in the sound, he heard the hiss of a steam engine. The branch line opening day, he said. Lydia's thin lips pulled into what might have been a smile. Exactly. In 3 days, Kessler will be there. The vice president from Omaha will be there. The whole town will be there. He'll be on a platform, giving a speech about progress and civilization. Reeves stood up. He looked at Marin, then at Lydia. He'll be on that platform, the one at Silver Junction, the same one where he tried to have her arrested. The plan was audacious. It was beautiful. It was a public execution, using only words. He'll have men everywhere, Lydia warned. Bram, Sutter, a dozen more. He'll be expecting a speech, Reeves said. Not an indictment. He looked at Marin. The choice was still hers, to run or to stand. Marin's mind was reeling. The fear was back, cold and sharp. The memory of Kessler's eyes on the platform. To go back there, to face him, to be the center of that storm. She felt her legs go weak. They left the chapel and mounted the horse. The ride back to the line shack silent. Una was waiting, pacing anxiously. Wren fussy in her arms. She agreed, Una said, seeing their faces. It worked. Reeves dismounted and took the baby from her. He held Wren against his chest, his large, rough hand patting her back. The baby, sensing his solidness, quieted. Marin watched him, her heart a painful knot. She saw the plan. It was perfect, and it terrified her. She was a ghost. How could she stand in the sun? Reeves turned to her, still holding Wren. He held the child out. Marin took her. As she settled Wren against her, the baby, now calm and feeling safe, looked up at her mother's face. And then, for the first time, a true, gurgling laugh escaped her. A pure, uncomplicated sound of joy. It was a sound that did not belong to the world of fear, of shadows, of murder. It was the sound of the future. Marin looked at Reeves over the baby's head. The old, nameless fear was still there, but the new, fierce hope had just found its voice. She took a deep breath. I'll stand on the name, she whispered. Reeves nodded. The plan was set. The next 2 days were a quiet hum of preparation. Ephraim rode a long 30-mile loop, visiting the neighboring ranches. He did not speak of murder or fraud. He spoke of Kessler and the railroad, and how it was time for the ranchers to show up and remind the company men who actually lived on the land. He told them to come to the branch line ceremony, to stand together. Una, back at her diner, began to bake. She baked dozens of loaves of bread. She packed crates of jerky and apples. She spread the word she was providing free food and water for everyone coming to the ceremony. It was not a protest. It was a celebration, a gathering, a reason for a crowd to form. On the last evening, Reeves found Marin standing outside the line shack, staring at the sunset. She was watching the rails in the distance, a thin iron ribbon that gleamed red in the dying light. It will be loud, he said, coming to stand beside her. There will be a band. Kessler will talk. People will be watching him. They will be watching me, she said, her voice tight. The nameless widow, the ghost. He was silent for a moment. Breathe, he said. She looked at him. When you feel the panic, he said, his voice as practical as if he were teaching her to saddle a horse. You breathe in through your nose. Slow. You hold it for a count. Then you let it out through your mouth. It stills the blood. He met her gaze. It will be a long 2 minutes, from the time we step onto that platform to the time Lydia speaks. Your heart will beat fast. When it does, look at me. It was not a request. It was an anchor, a promise. Look at me, he repeated. I'll be standing right there, and I'll be looking back. The afternoon sky, which had been a clear, hard blue, had turned a bruised purple. A sudden cold rain began to fall. Not a gentle mist, but a hard, driving sheet that hammered the tin roof of the stable and turned the dusty yard to mud. The wind that came with it was raw, carrying the smell of wet pine and ozone. Inside the line shack, it was warm. Reeves had built a small, steady fire in the hearth. Wren, fed and dry, was fast asleep in the cradle, her breathing the softest, most peaceful sound in the world. The steady shush of the rain on the roof and the crackle of the fire was a rhythm that sealed them off from the world. A small, safe bubble against the coming storm. Marin and Reeves stood on the small covered porch, watching the rain. They stood side by side, not touching, but aware of each other in the confined space. The air was cold, and Marin had a thin wool scarf, one of Una's, wrapped around her neck. A gust of wind whipped under the porch roof, catching the ends of the scarf and pulling it loose, flapping it against her face. She turned away from the wind, her fingers, cold and a little clumsy, fumbling with the knot. "I can't," she said, frustrated, her voice small. Reeves turned. He was close enough for her to feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Here," he said. He stepped in front of her, blocking the wind. She let her hands fall. She had to tilt her head back slightly to look at him. He raised his hands, his large, calloused hands, and she saw them hesitate for just a second, as if they were unsure of this new, gentle task. He did not just tie the knot. He carefully gathered the loose ends, his movements economical and precise. He smoothed the fabric, and then his fingers, rough from leather and iron, brushed the skin at the nape of her neck as he secured the scarf. It was the lightest touch. It was not a grasp, or a pull, or a lift. It was just a touch. A shiver, sudden and electric, ran straight down Marin's spine. Her skin prickled. It was not from the cold. It was from being seen. It was from being tended to, as if she were something of value. She looked down at the top button of his shirt, suddenly unable to meet his eyes. "I used to have no name," she whispered, the words spoken to his chest, a confession in the heart of the storm. His hands, which had finished their task, did not move away. They rested for a second on her shoulders, a light, steady weight. "Your name was your own," he answered, his voice a low rumble, felt more than heard. "You were always Marin Hale. I just said it out loud for you." Her breath caught. She looked up. He was not the silent cowboy from the station. He was not just the protector on the ridge. He was the man who had seen her when she was invisible. Slowly, she raised her hand. She did not know she was going to do it until her palm was flat against his chest, over his heart, beneath her hand. She felt the beat. It was not fast. It was slow and certain and strong, a bedrock rhythm. It was the complete opposite of the panicked, racing terror she had lived with for so long. His hand came up and covered hers, pressing it more firmly against him. His thumb moved, a small, circular motion against her knuckles. They stood there for a long, silent moment. The rain hammered the roof. The wind howled. Inside, Wren made a small, soft sigh in her sleep, a little coo of deep contentment. A smile touched Reeves's lips. Marin, seeing it, felt an answering smile on her own. It was the first shared, truly weightless moment they had ever had. The smile faded, but the warmth remained. His gaze dropped to her mouth, and then rose to meet her eyes. He was asking. She gave the smallest nod, a movement that was barely a movement at all. He leaned in. He was not a man of half measures, but this was not a rush. It was a purpose. He was slow. He kissed her. The first touch of his lips was soft, almost tentative. A question. It was warm. It tasted of the rain and the wood smoke from the fire. Marin's eyes drifted shut. She did not pull back. She leaned into it, her hand on his chest, the other coming up to rest on his shoulder. The kiss deepened. It was not a kiss of hunger, but of recognition. It was a long, slow, unfolding. It was the end of a very long journey. It was a promise that she was home. He pulled back, just an inch, his forehead resting against hers. Their breath mingled in the cold air. He looked at her. His eyes, those quiet winter sky eyes, were no longer quiet. They were full of a fire she had never seen. "Marin," he whispered, saying her name as if it were a prayer. "Yes," she whispered back. It was the answer to 1,000 unasked questions. He did not kiss her again on the porch. He swung one arm behind her back, the other under her knees, and lifted her. The motion was effortless, a single, fluid act. She was not a burden. She was something he was bringing to safety. Her arms went around his neck, her head resting on his shoulder. He kicked the door open with his boot and carried her inside, away from the storm, into the cabin. He did not take her to the bed. He set her down gently on her feet in front of the hearth, on the warm stone, where the firelight could touch her. The room was filled with the flickering, golden light. The shadows of the two of them, suddenly large, danced on the rough-hewn wooden walls. He did not take her. He looked at her. He raised a hand and, with his index finger, traced the line of her jaw, from her ear to her chin. He brushed a stray wisp of hair from her cheek. His eyes asked again. She answered by reaching for the buttons on his shirt. Her fingers were steady now. She unbuttoned the first and the second, her gaze never leaving his. He was not just a rescuer. He was a man. And she was not just a survivor. She was a woman. He stopped her hand. He took her hands in his and kissed her palms, first the right, then the left, his lips warm against her skin. Then, slowly, with a reverence that made her heart ache, he reached for the shoulders of her simple dress. He did not pull or tear. He eased the worn fabric down, over her shoulders, her collarbone. The dress fell, pooling at her feet like the last of her defenses, the last of her old fears. He cupped her face in his hands. She was standing in the firelight, in nothing but her thin cotton shift, and for the first time in her life, she felt not exposed, but truly seen. They came together not in a clash, but in a slow, certain merging. It was a promise, made in the quiet of the cabin, with the wind and the rain as their witnesses. It was a slow, deliberate covenant, built on shared glances, on quiet breaths, on the touch of skin. His hands on her waist, her hands on his chest, his mouth on her throat, her head falling back. It was a tender, quiet act of finding, of claiming, of absolute, unspoken agreement. It was gentle, and it was sure, and it was theirs. Later, the storm had passed. The rain had softened to a steady, quiet drumming on the roof. The fire had burned down to glowing red embers, casting a deep, warm light through the cabin. Wren was still fast asleep in her cradle, her small face serene, her tiny hand curled by her cheek. Marin lay beside Reeves, her head on his shoulder, his arm securely around her, pulling her close. His breathing was a slow, steady rhythm against her ear. She was warm. She was safe. She had a name. She lifted her head, just enough to see his face in the dim light. His eyes were open. He was watching her. She smiled. He did not smile back, but his eyes softened. "Tomorrow," she whispered, her voice husky. "You'll stand next to me?" He tightened his grip, pulling her more fully against the solid line of his body. "I will." "You'll be a witness," she said, needing to hear it, needing to connect this new, profound intimacy to the public battle that awaited them. "A witness for my name." He turned, shifting his body, bringing his face close to hers. He kissed her, a long, slow kiss that was no longer a question, but a statement, a vow. "I'll be there, Marin," he rumbled, his voice certain. "I'll be there." The Silver Junction platform was unrecognizable. Red, white, and blue bunting was draped over the raw pine of the station house, wilting in the bright, unforgiving sun. A small brass band, funded by the railroad and painfully out of tune, was murdering a rendition of a popular march. The air smelled of sweat, new bunting dye, and the champagne being poured for the railroad executives on the specially built speaking platform. At the center of it all, magnificent in a black tailcoat and a silk top hat, was Thorne Kessler. He was expansive, his arms wide, his voice projecting over the crowd. He spoke of civilization, of taming this wild land, of the great iron artery of progress. He was a man accepting applause for a battle he had never fought. On the far edge of the crowd, a man moved with no interest in the speech. Reeves Calder, in his dusty duster and worn hat, looked like a misplaced shadow. He hammered a rough wooden stake into the hard-packed earth, 20 yards from the platform. He moved to another spot and hammered a second. He strung a rope between them, then unfurled a large canvas tarp, tying it to the stakes like a crude exhibit. A few onlookers assumed it was a map of the new territories, part of the celebration. He checked the simple release knot, his face impassive, and then he melted back. Not into the crowd, but to a spot near the platform steps, and waited. The crowd was thick, townspeople in their Sunday best, railroad men in their suits, and a few curious miners. But another crowd had gathered, too. Ephraim Lyle stood near the back, his arms crossed. With him were 15, maybe 20, other ranchers and cowhands from the high country. They had not come for the music. They wore their range clothes, their faces weathered and hard. They did not clap. They did not cheer. They stood in a silent, solid line, their thumbs hooked in their belts, and they watched. A wagon clattered to a stop. Una Merritt climbed down, but she carried no bread, no water. She turned and helped another figure down, Lydia Voss, dressed in the same stark black as always, clutched a small, beaded reticule as if it were a weapon. Una guided her through the crowd, which parted, sensing the woman's grim purpose. They took their place beside Ephraim, a trinity of quiet defiance. On the platform, Kessler was reaching his peak. To the Union Pacific, and to the future we build. He raised his champagne glass for a toast. I give you progress. That was the signal. Reeves Calder yanked the rope. The knot gave way. The canvas tarp did not fall forward. It collapsed, dropping straight down to the dust, revealing what it had been concealing. It was not a map. It was a massive, hand-painted enlargement of the Vellum Manifest. Ephraim's meticulous work was there for all to see. 2 days of painstaking copying, the columns of fraudulent shipments, the rerouted compensation codes, the name Cheyenne repeated like a curse. And at the bottom, blown up to the size of a man's head, was Jonah Bell's tight, desperate handwriting. Kessler is stealing. He's rerouting. This is the proof. The brass band stopped. A single trumpet let out a dying, strangled note. The entire platform, the entire town, went utterly silent. Kessler froze, his glass held halfway to his lips, his face a mask of disbelief. Into this vacuum, Marin Hale stepped forward. She emerged from the side of the station, Una having given her a curt nod. She was holding Wren, who was wrapped in the simple, thin blanket. The crowd turned. Murmurs rippled. They knew her. It was the ghost, the nameless, ragged widow from 2 weeks ago. But this was not that woman. The woman who had sat on that bench was broken. This woman was forged. Her back was straight as a rifle barrel. Her hair was pulled back, her face clean, her eyes level and clear. She did not look at the crowd. She looked only at Thorne Kessler. She walked with a steady, measured pace, like a blade being drawn from a sheath, and stopped at the foot of the platform. Reeves moved from the shadows to stand just behind her, his hand not on his gun, but simply resting on his hip. He was a wall at her back. Lydia Voss moved next. She walked up the platform steps, her small, black-booted feet making a sharp, angry sound on the new wood. She walked straight to Kessler, who was still paralyzed, and stood beside him. Though she seemed to be on a different plane of existence, she pulled a pair of spectacles from her bag. perched them on her nose, and withdrew a single sheet of paper. She did not shout. Her voice was thin, but it was sharp, and it cut through the silence like a shard of glass. On March 12th, 1874, she read, her voice shaking not with fear, but with a cold, controlled rage. Thorne Kessler authorized compensation payment of 1 John Deere plow and 200 pounds of seed grain to Mr. Ephraim Lyle. Ephraim's head snapped up. That shipment was rerouted to the Cheyenne Depot and signed for by a T. Kessler. It was logged here as lost in transit, stolen. She continued. On April 2nd, a case of 20 Winchester rifles, compensation for the Miller Ranch, rerouted. On April 9th, 1 cast iron stove and 4 sets of tools. The names, the dates, the items. The crowd was no longer confused. They were listening. This was not slander. This was accounting. Kessler's face, which had been white, now flooded with a dark, mottled red. He slammed his glass down. He laughed. It was a short, sharp, ugly sound. "This is preposterous," he boomed. Finding his voice. "A senile old woman, addled by grief, reading lies. She is a slanderer, and this—" He jabbed a finger at Marin. This vagrant, this whore and her bastard, part of this conspiracy." He turned to his men, Bram and Sutter, who were standing at the side of the platform, their hands on their new pistols. "Bram, Sutter, do your jobs, arrest this woman, arrest them all for defamation and incitement." The two Pinkertons grinned, eager to enact some violence. They moved toward Lydia, their hands dropping to their holsters. "Our pleasure, Mr. Kessler." Reeves took one single, long step forward. He moved from behind Marin to the front of the platform, placing himself between the Pinkertons and Lydia. He did not draw his gun. As Sutter's hand closed on the grip of his pistol, Reeves's hand, large and scarred, shot out and clamped down over it, not on the hand, but on the gun itself, pinning it in the leather. He did the same to Bram, his other hand covering the man's holster. He pushed down. It was an act of impossible, quiet strength. The two men, expecting a gunfight, were frozen, their hands trapped, their bodies suddenly leveraged off balance. They were immobilized, not by violence, but by contempt. Reeves looked at them, his eyes flat and cold. "No," he said. The crowd surged. The line of ranchers, led by Ephraim, moved as one, forming a solid wall behind Reeves, their expressions daring the Pinkertons to try. The balance of power, in 1 second, had shifted. The crowd was no longer an audience. It was a jury. "She is not lying," Marin's voice rang out. It was not loud, but it was clear, and it stopped everyone. She stepped forward, past Reeves, and faced Kessler directly. "You're right about one thing. What you saw was just a copy." Her hands, steady, went to the blanket wrapped around Wren. "You called him a liar. You called her a slanderer. You called me a whore." She carefully unhooked the pin holding the blanket. "But Jonah Bell sent this to protect his child." She reached into the folds of the worn wool, into the secret hem. She pulled out the folded sheet of vellum, and she pulled out the heavy lead seal of the Union Pacific Railroad. She held them high, the sun glinting off the metal. "This is the original manifest, Mr. Kessler. This is the proof Jonah Bell died to protect. This is the evidence of your theft, in his own hand." The crowd gasped. The word "died" hung in the air, changing everything. "And this," Marin said, her voice finally breaking, not with weakness, but with a terrible, righteous fury, as she placed her hand on Wren's sleeping head, "is his daughter. This is Wren Bell, the rightful heir to the land you murdered him for." A woman in the front row screamed. The word "murderer" flew from the crowd. The railroad executives in their fine suits took a horrified step back from Kessler, as if he were diseased. Kessler was trapped. His authority was gone. His power, built in secret, had been publicly destroyed. He looked at Reeves, at Marin, at the wall of angry ranchers, and at the accusing face of the crowd. He made his choice. He spun on his heel, shoving a railroad vice president out of his way. He ran, his fine tailcoat flapping. Stumbling down the platform steps, he ran for his private car, the one at the end of the train, its engine already simmering, ready for his triumphant departure. As his polished boot hit the first iron step of the car, the train's massive brass bell began to ring, frantic and loud. Clang, clang, clang. It was not a signal for departure. It was an alarm, a desperate, shrieking accusation, echoing across the silent, stunned prairie. The bell was a scream. The crowd, which had been a solid, angry mass, broke. They surged back, driven by the primitive fear of a gunshot. Bram and Sutter, freed from Reeves's grip, knew the game was lost. They did not try to rearrest Lydia. They went to work. "Break it up! Get back!" Bram roared. And he fired his heavy shotgun, not at the crowd, but up into the clear blue sky. The blast was a physical concussion. Sutter did the same with his rifle. Panic erupted. Women screamed. Men cursed and ducked, pulling their families away, scrambling for cover. The solid wall of ranchers broke as people scrambled for safety. It was the cover Kessler needed. The train's engine gave a powerful, shuddering chuff. Steam blasted from its pistons. The great wheels began to turn. Kessler, his face white with rage, had his hand on the railing of his private car, swinging himself aboard. Marin saw him. She saw him escaping. All of it, the fear, the fight, the name. The child's future was about to be pulled away down that track. "Una!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the din. Una, who had been shielding Ren, looked up, her face pale. Marin shoved Ren, blanket and all, into Una's arms with a force that was almost violent. "Hold her! Don't let him go!" She did not wait for an answer. She ran. But Reeves was already in motion. He was not a man built for sprinting, but he moved with a long, ground-eating lope, his duster flying out behind him. He ignored the passenger cars. He ran alongside the accelerating engine, his eyes fixed on a flatbed car just behind the coal tender. The train was picking up speed. The flatbed was moving faster than a man could run. Reeves put on a burst of speed, his boots pounding the gravel. He reached the end of the car, grabbed the cold iron hand rung, and planted his foot. He did not climb. He let the train's momentum snatch him from the ground, swinging his entire body through the air, his legs bicycling, until he landed with a thud on the splintery wooden deck. He was up. Soot and hot cinders from the smokestack immediately blasted his face, a gritty, stinging rain. Marin saw him make it. She was right behind him, but she was smaller, and the train was moving too fast. She couldn't make the same jump. She looked at the coupling between the flatbed and the next car back. A baggage car. It was a churning, dangerous mess of metal, but there was an iron ladder. She ran, her breath sobbing in her chest. She jumped, not for the flatbed, but for the ladder on the baggage car. Her fingers, raw and scraped, caught the lowest rung. Her feet missed the step. For one agonizing second, she dangled. Her body slammed against the side of the car, the gravel rushing past only inches below her boots. She heard Reeves roar her name. She ignored it. She used the terror, the anger. She found a foothold, jammed her boot onto the iron step, and hauled herself up, rung by rung. As she reached the top, she looked across the swaying, lurching gap. Reeves was standing on the flatbed, his legs braced. Their eyes met in that single, wind-blasted second. With the world blurring past, they were a single unit. The trust was absolute. A shadow moved on the flatbed. Bram, the heavy Pinkerton, had swung himself up after Reeves. He saw Reeves, saw the man who had humiliated him, and he charged, his head down, a thick, angry bellow tearing from his throat. Reeves was on an open, unstable platform. Bram was a bull. Reeves did not draw his gun. He did not brace for the impact. He bent, his hand snatching a heavy, grease-caked lashing chain from the deck. Bram was 2 steps away when Reeves swung it. He swung it low, not at the man's head, but at his legs. The heavy chain wrapped around Bram's ankles. A sudden, iron snare. Reeves yanked. Bram, all his forward momentum working against him, was flipped. He went down like a felled tree, his head cracking against the wooden deck with a sickening, wet thud. He did not move again. Reeves unhooked the man's pistol from its holster and, without a glance, hurled it into the blur of the prairie. One was down. At the same moment, the door to the baggage car was ripped open. Sutter, the younger, nervous Pinkerton, stood there. He had come through the car. He saw Marin, still clinging to the top of the ladder, exposed. He raised his rifle. His face was pale, his eyes wide with panic. He was going to shoot. Marin was trapped. She had nowhere to go, no cover. Her eyes darted. Just inside the baggage car, hanging from a hook, was a standard-issue railroad lantern, its flame burning brightly. With a desperate animal cry, she lunged sideways, grabbing the hot wire handle of the lantern. She ignored the pain as the metal seared her palm. She swung it, not at Sutter, but at his feet. The glass globe shattered on the wooden floor. Lamp oil, burning hot, splashed everywhere. The floor erupted. A solid, roaring wall of fire shot up between them. Sutter screamed, a high, thin sound. He leapt back, beating at the flames that had instantly licked up his trousers. He was blinded, trapped, the smoke and fire filling the narrow doorway. Reeves saw it. He saw the fire, saw Sutter, saw Marin safe on the ladder. He took 2 running steps and leaped across the 6-foot swaying gap between the flatbed and the baggage car, landing with a solid crunch on the other side. He hit Sutter. The man was still flapping at his smoking boots. His rifle dropped. Reeves's punch was not a brawl. It was a precise, economical act. His fist landed high on Sutter's jaw. The man's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed, his head hitting the floor. Marin scrambled into the car, her hand a raw, red map of pain. She saw Sutter on the floor, unconscious. She looked at the wall. A heavy iron coat hook was bolted to the frame. She grabbed Sutter's limp wrist, dragged him to the wall, and, with a grunt of effort, hooked his arm, cuff and all, securely onto the iron hook. He was pinned, neutralized. They were through. The fire was already dying, a smoking, oily patch on the floor. Reeves kicked the far door of the baggage car open, and there he was. Kessler. He was not in his luxury car. He was in the narrow, open-air space of the coupling, the connector between the 2 cars. He had been trying to uncouple his private car, to leave the rest of the train, and them, behind. He had failed. He looked up. His face, which had been red with rage, now turned a pasty, sick white. His silk hat was gone. His fine suit was smeared with grease. He saw Reeves in the doorway in front of him. He heard a noise, and he turned. Marin, her face streaked with soot, her hair wild, her hand wrapped in a bloody piece of her own dress, stepped into the doorway behind him. The trap was shut. He was caught between them, high above the ground, on a swaying piece of iron. The train, which had been accelerating, suddenly gave a massive, shuddering lurch. The brakes screamed, a terrifying, drawn-out shriek of metal on metal. The engineer, seeing the fire, the fight, and the men on the flatbed, had slammed the emergency brake. With a final, bone-jarring groan, the train stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the howl of the wind. They were not at the station. They were not on the prairie. The train had stopped in the dead center of the Sweetwater Trestle, a long, high bridge of spindly wooden legs, 100 feet above the dry. rocky creek bed below. Kessler looked down, his eyes wide with a new, acrophobic terror. Then came a new sound, the sound of running feet. Not on the train, but on the gravel of the track bed. A man in a simple vest stepped onto the bridge. He had a tin star pinned to it. He was not the town marshal. This was a deputy county marshal, a man with broader authority. He was flanked by Ephraim, who was carrying a rifle, and by Lydia Voss. Behind them, a dozen of the ranchers, who had sprinted after the train, fanned out, blocking the way back. Lydia had not been lying. She had not trusted the local law. She had sent a wire to the county seat 2 days ago. The deputy raised his hand. "Thorne Kessler!" His voice boomed in the sudden quiet. Marin stepped forward, onto the coupling platform. She was shaking, but she did not fall. She held out the vellum, the lead seal clutched in a raw hand. "Here is the proof," she said, her voice clear and carrying on the wind. "Here is the proof of his fraud, and his reason for murdering Jonah Bell." Lydia Voss stepped onto the bridge. "I am Lydia Voss. I was the wife of Station Master Arlo Voss. I witnessed the creation of these false documents. I confirm this evidence. I am the witness." The deputy marshal nodded, his face grim. He took the vellum from Marin. He looked at Kessler, who was now trembling, his authority gone, a pathetic, trapped figure. The deputy pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Thorne Kessler, by the authority of the Wyoming Territory, you are under arrest for federal mail and wire fraud, bribery, and on suspicion of the murder of Jonah Bell." The wind howled across the high, open trestle, pulling at Marin's dress, whipping her hair across her face. She stood tall, the soot on her face like paint, her burned hand at her side. Reeves was beside her, his duster settling around him, a solid, unmovable shadow. Her name, the one she had been given in shame on a station platform, had just been cemented in truth, high above the earth, between the wind and the iron. The tracks that had brought her here as a nameless ghost now served as the foundation for her, for Marin Hale. Justice, in the Wyoming Territory, did not arrive in a marble courthouse. It arrived on horseback, with a weary circuit judge, and it convened where it could. The great freight warehouse at Silver Junction, which had been the hub of Kessler's stolen empire, was transformed. The smell of grain, machine oil, and burlap hung heavy in the air. Judge Elias Harlan, a man with a face carved from dry riverbed and eyes that had seen too much to be fooled, sat at a freight desk. The deputy marshal stood at his side. The room was packed, ranchers, miners, and the townspeople stood in the shadows, their faces pale in the light from the high, dusty windows. Lydia Voss, Una Merritt, and Ephraim Lyle stood as the chief witnesses. At the front, on a hard wooden bench, sat Thorne Kessler, his fine suit stained, his wrists in cuffs, his face a mask of empty, sulphurous rage. Reeves and Marin stood near the judge's desk. Marin held Wren, who was quiet, her wide eyes taking in the strange, solemn gathering. Judge Harlan's voice was dry, but it filled the cavernous space. "I have reviewed the evidence. The vellum manifest, authenticated by the company's own seal. I have the sworn, courageous testimony of Mrs. Lydia Voss, who preserved this evidence at great personal risk. I have the logbooks from her late husband, and I have the physical testimony of Miss Marin Hale, who was unwittingly made a courier for this conspiracy, and who, with Mr. Reeves Calder, subdued the perpetrators during their attempt to flee." He did not waste words. He looked at Kessler, his gaze flat and hard as iron. "The evidence is absolute. This was not business. This was a criminal enterprise, theft, fraud, conspiracy, and, pending the full investigation, murder." He dipped his pen in the inkwell. "This court, by the authority of the territory, hereby rules All land compensation claims filed by Thorne Kessler are declared null and void. The Union Pacific Railroad will restore, in full, all seized property and payments to the named settlers, including Mr. Lyle, 1 John Deere plow, plus 10% interest. A low murmur of approval ran through the crowd. Ephraim just nodded, his jaw tight. Furthermore, the judge continued, his voice rising, all personal assets of Thorne Kessler, including his accounts in Cheyenne, are hereby seized by this court. A trust will be immediately established. The entirety of this fund will be dedicated to the care, education, and future of the minor child, Wren Bell, the sole heir of Jonah Bell. He looked at his clerk. Sign it. The clerk did. The judge took his heavy brass seal, the one with the county eagle, and slammed it down on the paper. The thud was final. Justice, in the end, was a piece of paper backed by a gun and the will of the people. As the deputy hauled Kessler to his feet, the judge looked at Marin. One last piece of business, ma'am, for the court record, the testimony, the trust. It all needs your name as the primary witness. He pushed a thick, leather-bound county ledger across the desk. Please state your full, legal name. This was the moment. She looked at Reeves. He was not looking at her. He was watching the ledger, giving her the space to own this. She stepped forward. My name is Marin Hale, she said, her voice clear. The judge nodded. Please sign. She took the pen. She remembered the station platform, the woman with no name, no papers, no future, the ghost. She dipped the pen. She set the nib to the paper. Her hand did not shake. She wrote the 2 words, the ink dark and certain, Marin Hale. She set the pen down. It was done. They stepped out of the warehouse, emerging from the dust and shadows into the bright, blinding sunlight. The crowd was dispersing, the tension broken, replaced by a low, excited buzz. Una, her face streaked with tears, came and took Wren from Marin's arms, hugging her. Ephraim shuffled over, rubbing the back of his neck, his face screwed up in a rare, awkward flush. He looked at Reeves, then at Marin, then at the ground. Well, he mumbled, that's a thing. Then, good work. He cleared his throat. Reeves, you've been off the ranch for nigh on 2 weeks with all this. Left the herd. I know, Ephraim, Reeves said. Well, Ephraim said, digging his boot into the dirt. Seems you and her, well, he gestured vaguely between them. Might as well. The parson's in town for the circuit. You should just, take the rest of the day. Get it done proper. Reeves, the man who had faced down shotguns and leaped between moving train cars, turned a deep, dusky red. He looked at his boots. He looked at the sky. He finally looked at Marin. And in his eyes, she saw the silent, burning question, the hope that was more terrifying to him than any fight. Marin felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. She smiled, a real, full smile. She stepped closer to him and put her hand on his arm, a simple, public act of possession. Thank you, Ephraim, she said, her voice gentle. I think that's a fine idea. She looked up at Reeves, her eyes holding his, sharing the memory of the rainy night. But first, she turned, holding his arm, and walked them both back into the warehouse. The judge was packing his valise. Judge Harlan. He looked up, surprised. Miss Hale, I have one more request, she said. The trust. You named it for Wren Bell. I want to make that official. Her name, can you enter it into the county registry? Her father was Jonah Bell. Her mother was Anna. I want her to have his name. I want her to be registered. So the story is told right. So he is remembered. The judge stopped packing. He looked at this woman, at her burned and bandaged hand, at the quiet, solid man standing beside her. He was a man of law, but he was not a fool. He saw what this was. This was not about money. This was about legacy. This was about making the dead count. He took the ledger back out. "It would be my honor, Miss Hale." He opened the book to the births and registries. With a careful, steady hand, he wrote Wren Bell, daughter of Jonah Bell. He blew the ink dry and closed the book. The air at Dry Creek Bend felt different, lighter. The following days, the sound of a hammer rang out. Reeves had moved their few possessions from the line shack into the main cabin. It was their home. He was on a ladder, adding a small, sloped roof over the front porch, extending the cabin's shelter. It was an act of permanence. Marin came out, holding a cup of water for him. He climbed down, his face damp with sweat. He was holding something in his hand. It was the scarf, the thin, worn scrap of wool Una had given her, the one she had fumbled with in the rain, the one he had tied. He did not hand it to her. He walked to the new raw pine support beam of the porch and, with a few precise motions, tied the scarf around it. The wind, coming down from the high country, caught it. The small piece of fabric fluttered, a tiny, defiant flag. "What's that for?" she asked, smiling. Reeves looked at it, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were soft. "It's a flag," he said, his voice low. "So the wind knows this place is claimed." It was a signal of peace, a sign that the running was over. That night, the peace was a physical thing. It was in the air, in the scent of the pine fire. Wren was fast asleep in the cradle, her small face angelic in the warm light. Marin was sitting on the floor by the hearth, her back resting against Reeves's legs as he sat on a stool, mending a bridle strap. She was holding the small, leather-bound notebook she had taken from the shelf in what felt like another lifetime. She read aloud, her voice soft, the words tasting different now. "Smell pine tar, lamp oil, cold metal." She looked at the fire. "I thought these were the last pieces of a life that was gone. I thought I was broken." She turned the page. Words, Voss. Branch line 3. A small laugh escaped her. They weren't an ending. They were a beginning. They were the map, pointing me right here. They weren't fragments of fear. They were just the first words of the story. Reeves's hands, strong and sure, stopped their work. He rested one on her shoulder, his thumb brushing her collarbone. "Reeves," she whispered, leaning her head back against his knee. "I was no one. I was a ghost. You gave me my name." He was silent for a long time. The only sounds were the fire and the sleeping child. His hand moved from her shoulder, his fingers threading into her hair, a touch that was both protective and possessive. "No," he said, his voice a low, certain rumble that vibrated through her. "I didn't name you." She looked up at him, questioning. "Your name was always there. Marin," he said. You just needed a quiet place to hear it. I didn't give you a name. I just stood next to the one you chose for yourself. That's all." She closed her eyes, letting the truth of that settle over her. He had not been her savior. He had been her witness. She looked at the sleeping child, the simple cradle Reeves had built, the warm fire, the man at her back. These were not the grand things of Kessler's world. They were not silk suits or private rail cars. They were wood and fire and trust. They were a fortress. Miles away, at the Silver Junction station, a new notice was tacked to the main bulletin board, covering an old, faded wanted poster. It was crisp, the ink dark. "Notice, the Kettle Ridge branch line is now officially open." The old, complex map of Kessler's winding, fraudulent route was gone. In its place was a new one. The line was straight, clean, and efficient, and at the bottom, a new line had been added, in the same hand as the county ledger. Route approved. Through easement granted by the estate of Jonah Bell, the people's land makes the line straight. The sunset at Dry Creek Bend was not a gentle fading. It was a fire. The sky over the western ridge bled out in streaks of deep orange, violet, and a final, defiant slash of crimson. The light, warm and golden, washed over the small ranch, turning the weathered wood of the cabin to honey and the metal blades of the windmill to silent, spinning gold. The land was quiet, breathing in the first cool air of the evening. The storm was over. They did not hold the wedding in the drafty chapel or the dusty courthouse. Reeves had built the place for it. He had chosen the spot, not by the cabin, but further out, near the edge of the ranch land. He had built their altar directly beneath the tall, skeletal legs of the railroad water tower. It was a strange, powerful choice. It was the railroad's mark on his land, a structure of iron and industry. But it was also the source of the water that gave the ranch life. It was a symbol of the very thing that had brought them all to ruin. And now, he was reclaiming it. He was making it a witness. He had sunk 4 posts of fresh-cut pine into the earth, forming a simple, perfect square. He had draped a length of clean white linen over the top, a canopy that snapped and fluttered in the evening breeze. It was not an arch of roses. It was a statement 4 square, solid, and open to the sky. Marin walked from the cabin. She had made the dress herself. In the quiet days after the trial, it was not silk or lace. It was simple, cream-colored muslin, sewn with small, careful stitches. It had a clean neckline and fell straight to her boots. She was, for the first time, beautiful in her simplicity, not in her survival. And in her hair, which she wore loose and clean, she had tied the scarf, the thin, faded piece of wool, the one she had fumbled with on the porch in the rain. It was not there to hide anything. It was not a remnant of a past she was ashamed of. It was a ribbon. It was a trophy. It was the proof of the moment he had first, truly, seen her. The parson, the same circuit judge who had given them their justice, waited by the arch, his book open. Their audience was small, but they were the ones who mattered. Una stood to one side, her broad, kind face shining. She was holding Wren. The baby was not in her orphan's blanket. She was dressed in a small gown of bright, hopeful green. And she was, for the first time, cooing and laughing at the strange, beautiful light, her tiny fists batting at the air. Ephraim was there, standing next to Una, his hat in his gnarled hands. He was wearing a clean shirt, a fact so shocking it was almost comical. And Lydia Voss, in her severe black, stood like a small, iron pillar of salt. The parson was a man of the prairie. He knew words were cheap and time was precious. "We are gathered," he said, his voice carrying on the wind, "in the sight of God and of this land, to join 2 people, Reeves Calder and Marin Hale." He looked at Ephraim. "Is there anyone to speak for this woman?" Ephraim started, his face turning a dark red. He had been coached for this. He stepped forward, cleared his throat, and looked at Marin. She's, well," he looked at Reeves. "She's a hard worker. She can muck a stall, and," he stopped. His tough, leathery face, the one that had not flinched at Kessler, suddenly crumpled. His eyes filled. He nodded. Once, a sharp, choked motion. "She's good," he whispered. "That's all. She's good." He retreated, swiping at his face with his sleeve. The parson nodded, accepting this as the highest of praise. He looked to Lydia. "A reading." Lydia stepped forward. She did not open a Bible. She held no paper. She looked at Marin, and her voice, that thin, sharp instrument of truth, cut through the air. "Truth doesn't need to scream," she said. "It just needs a place to stand." She looked at the arch, at the man and woman standing under it. "It has found its place here." She stepped back. The parson looked at Reeves. "The vows." Reeves turned, his entire body to face Marin. He looked massive, a mountain. In the dying light, He took her hands. His were rough, scarred, and warm. Hers, still healing from the lantern's burn, fit inside them perfectly. He was a silent man. The crowd, the parson, the world, all faded. He spoke, and his voice was so low. It was only for her. It was the sound of bedrock. "Marin," he said, his voice thick. "At the station, in the cold. I said, 'You have one now.' It was all I knew how to give. Just a thing. A name." He swallowed, his gaze locked on hers, his eyes full of that fire she had seen by the hearth, that fire that was only for her. "But today," he said, his voice breaking just a little, "standing here, on our land, I get to say it right. Today. Marin Hale. We have one now." He was not giving her a name. He was joining his to hers. He was making them a single, solid unit, a we. Tears, hot and sudden, spilled over her cheeks. She did not wipe them away. She just smiled, her heart so full it ached. "We do," she whispered. He lifted a hand, his thumb, impossibly gentle, brushing the tear from her cheek, and then he leaned in, and he kissed her. It was not the kiss from the porch, full of storm and new fire. It was not the kiss from the firelight, full of discovery. This was a kiss of pure, undiluted peace. It was long and slow and sure. It was a vow all on its own. It was the sealing of a contract that had been signed in fire and soot and justice. And as they stood there, locked together under the open sky, a sound drifted in from the far distance, miles away. On the new, straight tracks, a train was passing. A long, lonely, mournful whistle echoed across the prairie. It was not an alarm. It was not a threat. It was a salute. They broke the kiss, but they did not move apart. They stood forehead to forehead, just breathing. The small crowd, Ephraim and Una, burst into applause, a rough, heartfelt clapping. Una, crying openly, held up Wren, who was bouncing and laughing, sensing the joy. Marin turned, her arm still linked with Reeves's, and she took her child. She took Wren from Una's arms. She held the baby up, lifting her high into the air, into the last golden rays of the sun. "Wren Bell," Marin said, her voice strong and clear, a mother's declaration to the world. "You will grow up with your name. You will grow up in the light. You will not grow up in the shadow of fear. This is your home." The applause grew louder, and just then, a gust of wind, a clean, sharp breath from the high country, swept under the water tower. It caught the thin, wool scarf tied in Marin's hair. It lifted the fabric, pulling it free, making it snap and flutter in the air like a small, brave flag. It was a flag for a nation of two, a flag for a child with a name, a flag for every person who had ever been lost and had, against all odds, been found, a flag for those who had named themselves. Reeves pulled her close, his arm a solid bar around her waist. He bent his head, his lips brushing her ear, his voice a quiet rumble against her skin. "Marin," he whispered, "if anyone ever asks who you are." She turned her head. She did not look at him. She looked straight ahead, at the vast, darkening prairie, at the iron rails that stretched to the horizon, at the future. She smiled, a slow, sure smile that started in her heart and lit her face. "I am Marin Hale." The light was gone. The world was purple and silver. The ranch was a collection of shadows and a single, warm light in the cabin window. The windmill turned, a silent silhouette. The water tower stood guard. The railroad track stretched on, a promise of connection, no longer a threat of escape. And in the quiet, as the first stars began to pierce the velvet sky, a voice echoed, the first words he had ever spoken to her. But they were different now. They were not flat and cold. They were warm. They were a promise. They were complete. You do now. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. So please leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video. And give us your support by hitting that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.